Somewhere on the plains of northern Kenya, a mother elephant lifts her head, opens her mouth, and makes a sound too low for you to hear. You could stand 3 feet away and feel nothing but a faint pressure in your chest. But across the grass, a specific calf, not just any calf, Hayes, turns and starts walking toward her. Scientists just fed 10,000 hours of these sounds into a machine learning model, and what came out the other side is something researchers spent 40 years afraid to say out loud. Elephants call each other by name. Not a signal, not a general cry of distress or hunger or "I'm over here." An actual, individually specific label, aimed at one particular elephant, out of an entire family, out of an entire herd, out of every elephant that has ever lived. And the elephant being called knows it's her. This isn't speculation dressed up as a headline. It's a peer-reviewed study, published in June 2024 in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution, built on decades of recordings from some of the most respected elephant researchers alive. And once you understand how they found it, and what it means, you'll understand why some scientists are calling it one of the largest revisions to our understanding of animal minds in a generation. Let's start with the animal itself, because the discovery only makes sense once you understand what kind of creature we're actually dealing with. The African savanna elephant is the largest land animal on Earth, capable of reaching 7 tons and living past 60 years. Its brain weighs somewhere between 10 and 13 pounds, roughly 3 times the mass of a human brain. Size alone doesn't tell the whole story, though. What matters more is architecture. The elephant's temporal lobe, the brain region tied to memory and social processing in humans, is proportionally larger than ours. That's genuinely unusual. In most mammals, brain regions scale with body size in fairly predictable ratios. Elephants break the pattern. Their brains also contain something called von Economo neurons, elongated, spindle-shaped cells that scientists once believed existed only in great apes, humans, and a handful of other highly social species. These neurons are linked to empathy, self-awareness, and the kind of rapid social judgment that complex group living demands. Their presence in elephants tells us that whatever produced sophisticated social cognition in primates also happened, independently, inside an entirely different branch of the evolutionary tree. And the behavior backs up the anatomy. In 2006, researchers Joshua Plotnick and Franz de Waal showed that an Asian elephant named Happy could recognize herself in a mirror, investigating a mark painted on her own body using her reflection, rather than treating the image as another elephant. Self-recognition is one of the rarest cognitive traits in the animal kingdom. Great apes have it. Dolphins have it. A few corvids may show partial versions of it. Almost nothing else does. Elephants do. Then there's the behavior around death. Elephants don't just walk past the remains of another elephant. They stop. They touch the bones and tusks with their trunks, sometimes for long stretches of time. Families have been documented returning to the same remains years later. There are recorded instances of elephants covering a body with branches and date. Nobody claims to know exactly what's happening inside an elephant's mind in those moments, and researchers are careful not to overstate it. But the pattern is consistent. It's been seen across multiple populations on multiple continents, and it simply doesn't show up anywhere else in the animal kingdom outside of humans. So we already knew elephants were exceptional before anyone analyzed a single vocalization. The vocal side of the story starts in a completely different place, a zoo in Portland, Oregon. In 1984, a bioacoustician named Katie Payne was standing near the elephant enclosure at the Washington Park Zoo. Payne had spent years studying humpback whale song alongside her husband, so she already understood something most people don't, that animals can communicate in ways human senses aren't built to catch. Standing near the elephants that day, she felt something strange. Not a sound, exactly. A throbbing pressure in her chest, a kind of pulse moving through the air. She'd felt something similar before, standing near the largest pipes of a cathedral organ, the ones that produce notes so low you feel them instead of hearing them. She went back with equipment built to record infrasound, frequencies below roughly 20 Hz, well under the floor of human hearing. What she captured confirmed her hunch. The elephants were producing long, structured calls between 14 and 35 Hz, patterned, contextual, and clearly capable of triggering specific responses in other elephants nearby. An entire communication channel had been running the whole time humans had been observing elephants, completely inaudible to us. That discovery reshaped the field. Payne went on to found the Elephant Listening Project at Cornell University, which eventually expanded its work to forest elephants in Central Africa, monitoring acoustic behavior at sites like Dangaba in the Central African Republic. And infrasound explained things field researchers had puzzled over for years. Elephant families separated by miles of open terrain converging at a waterhole at almost the same moment, with no audible cue that anyone could detect. Low-frequency sound travels differently than the sounds we're used to. It bends around obstacles. It rides the layered air of the savanna, sometimes carried by temperature inversions for kilometers. Elephants had evolved a communication system tuned precisely to their landscape, operating below the hearing range of most predators, including us. That was the first major crack in how we understood elephant minds. It wasn't the last. To understand where the 2024 discovery actually came from, you need to know about a patch of land in southern Kenya, at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. In 1972, an American researcher named Cynthia Moss arrived in Amboseli National Park and began quietly doing something nobody had done before, identifying and tracking every individual elephant in the population, documenting births, deaths, family lines, and social bonds, one animal at a time. More than 50 years later, that project is still running. It is the longest continuous study of wild elephants anywhere in the world. Because of that project, researchers today have something almost unheard of in wildlife biology: multi-generational life histories for entire elephant families, cross-referenced with decades of recorded vocalizations, tied to known individuals whose relationships to each other are already mapped in extraordinary detail. Around the same time, another researcher named Joyce Poole, working alongside Peter Granley, began cataloging the structure of elephant calls themselves. Their organization, Elephant Voices, sorted elephant rumbles into functional categories: contact calls used to stay connected across distance, greeting calls used during reunions, alarm calls, mating calls, and coordinated let's go rumbles used by matriarchs to move the group. The calls clearly carried social and emotional meaning. But whether they contained anything like reference, whether a call could point to a specific individual the way a human word can, remained an open question for decades. Part of the caution came from history. In the 1970s and 80s, ape language research faced serious backlash, particularly around signing gorillas and chimpanzees whose abilities researchers may have overstated. That episode left an entire generation of animal cognition scientists deliberately conservative in their language, unwilling to use words like name or reference unless the evidence was airtight. So the elephant vocalization data sat there for years, rich, structured, clearly meaningful, but resistant to the kind of proof that would let anyone make a stronger claim. Meanwhile, a separate line of research was quietly stacking up evidence that elephants understood far more about their world than anyone expected. Karen McComb, at the University of Sussex, ran a striking experiment in 2014. Her team played wild elephants in Amboseli recordings of human voices speaking two different languages: Ma, spoken by Maasai pastoralists, some of whom have historically come into lethal conflict with elephants over grazing land and livestock, and Kamba, spoken by a farming community that poses comparatively little direct threat. When the elephants heard Maasai men's voices, they reacted defensively, bunching together, retreating, raising their trunks to investigate the source. When they heard Kamba men, or Maasai women, or Maasai boys, the defensive reaction dropped off sharply. The elephants weren't just recognizing human voice. They were sorting voices into categories, by language, by gender, by age, and adjusting their behavior based on which category represented more risk. That requires memory of past encounters, the ability to generalize a new voice into an existing category, and some way of passing that knowledge through the group, since no single elephant could personally experience every type of encounter. McComb's other research looked at leadership. In playback experiments simulating lion roars, family groups led by older matriarchs responded more accurately to danger, correctly distinguishing the more dangerous roar of a male lion from the less dangerous roar of a female, and calibrating their group's response accordingly. Younger-led groups made worse calls. The implication was clear: an elephant's brain doesn't just store personal memories. It functions as a kind of living archive of decades of ecological knowledge, and that archive gets passed down and consulted in real time. All of this, the infrasound, the mirror test, the morning behavior, the voice discrimination, the matriarch knowledge, was on the table well before anyone applied machine learning to the question of names. But even with all that evidence, human researchers listening to elephant rumbles by a kept running into a wall. The calls were too long, too acoustically dense, and too subtly varied for manual analysis to pull out their full structure. Whatever information the elephants were encoding, human perception alone couldn't extract it. That's where the AI comes in. A researcher named Michael Pardo, working through Cornell's bioacoustics program and later Colorado State University, pulled together a collaboration that reads like a who's who of elephant research. Save the Elephants, Colorado State University, Cynthia Moss's Amboselli Project, Joyce Poole and Petter Granley's Elephant Voices, and bioacoustic specialist Kurt Fristrup. Combined, their recordings and field notes stretched across decades, multiple family groups, and more than 10,000 hours of audio. Every call timestamped and cross-referenced with who was calling, who was nearby, what was happening socially, and, critically, how the elephant on the receiving end responded. The team trained machine learning models, including random forest algorithms, to search for patterns linking specific callers to specific receivers. The question was simple to state and brutally hard to answer by A. When an elephant called out to one particular individual, did that call contain acoustic features distinct enough that the intended receiver could be predicted from the sound alone, regardless of how similar or different that call was to sounds the receiving elephant typically made herself? The answer was yes. And this detail matters more than it might seem at first. The name wasn't built by imitating the receiver's own voice. That's actually the opposite of how naming works in the two other species best known for something similar. Dolphins and parrots address each other by mimicking the specific signature call of whoever they're addressing, essentially repeating the other individual's own signature sound back at them. Elephants weren't doing that. Their calls carried an arbitrary label for the receiver, unconnected to any sound that individual elephant typically produced. That's a much closer match to how human naming actually works. Nothing about the sound Sarah resembles anything Sarah herself does. It's a pure, abstract label. The paper, published under the careful, deliberately understated title African Elephants Address One Another with Individually Specific Name-like Calls, didn't declare that elephants have names exactly the way humans do. Science doesn't work that way, and the researchers knew it. What they reported, precisely, was that specific calls contained acoustic patterns tied to specific caller-receiver pairs, and that when researchers played those calls back, the intended recipient reacted differently, and more strongly, than other elephants did. In the National Geographic coverage of the study, Pardo described one striking example. An elephant named Donatella, hearing a playback of a call that had originally been addressed to her, called back repeatedly and moved toward the speaker. Calls meant for other elephants got a much weaker reaction, or none at all. That's the heart of what makes this different from every other known animal signal. It isn't a general contact call meaning I'm here or where's everyone. It's directional. It's addressed. It contains information that identifies who it's for, and the elephant it's for recognizes that fact. That is, in the technical sense, referential communication. Communication that points to something beyond the sound itself. In this case, the identity of a specific individual. Researchers had documented pieces of this kind of referential ability before in a small number of other species, some primates, a few bird species, and marine mammals like dolphins. But this was the first time it had been demonstrated, in the published scientific record, in a non-primate, non-marine, land-dwelling mammal. There's more buried in that same 10,000-hour dataset that researchers are still working through. The analysis suggests the name-like components aren't static. They seem to shift depending on the relationship between the caller and receiver, and the social context of the moment. A mother addressing her calf appears to use different patterns than a matriarch addressing an adult member of the family. Calls tied to reunions look different from calls tied to coordinated movement. If that holds up under further study, it would mean the name isn't just a flat label. It's embedded inside a broader system that also encodes something about the nature of the relationship itself, similar to how a person might be called by a nickname by one family member and a formal name by a colleague. The label and the relationship are intertwined. It's worth being honest about where the science currently stands, because that honesty is exactly what makes this discovery credible rather than sensational. Since the original 2024 publication, at least one follow-up analysis has pushed back on parts of the methodology, questioning whether the specific machine learning approach used might have introduced bias into how confidently individual calls could be matched to receivers. That's normal. That's how science is supposed to work. A striking result gets published, other researchers stress-test it, and the field converges slowly toward a more solid understanding. The original research team stands behind their playback experiments, which showed real behavioral differences in how elephants responded to calls addressed to them versus calls addressed to others, independent of the machine learning classification itself. The full picture of exactly how specific and how name-like these calls really are will keep getting refined. But the core finding, that elephants direct individually specific calls at individually specific receivers, and that receivers respond accordingly, has held up well enough to reshape how researchers talk about elephant communication going forward. Zoom out, and this fits into a much bigger pattern that scientists have been circling for years. Dolphins use individual signature whistles that function as names, although through imitation rather than arbitrary labeling. Sperm whales, through research led by groups like Project Seti, produce clicking patterns called coders that may carry combinatorial, almost phonetic structure. Parrots can learn human words and use them in ways that go beyond simple mimicry. Certain crows and other corvids show forms of symbolic reasoning in lab settings that once seemed reserved for primates. Language, or something meaningfully close to it, appears to have evolved more than once, in more than one branch of the animal kingdom, completely independently. The pattern connecting all of these species isn't random. Elephants, dolphins, and great apes share something specific: long lifespans, complex social groups, and individual relationships that persist for years or decades. All of them need some way to coordinate behavior across distance and across time, with individuals they may not see again for weeks or months. One reasonable hypothesis emerging from this research is that sophisticated, referential communication isn't a strange evolutionary accident unique to humans. It's closer to a predictable outcome. When a species lives long, forms deep individual bonds, and depends on tracking who's who across a complex social web, something like naming tends to show up, because it solves a real problem those animals actually face. The biologist Franz de Waal, who spent his career building the case that human minds aren't as categorically separate from animal minds as we like to think, died in March 2024, just months before this elephant paper came out. He didn't get to see it published, but it fits squarely into the body of work he built. Nothing in this research claims elephants possess human language, with its grammar, its syntax, its infinite combinatorial range. What it does show is that elephants possess a communication system with individual addressing, contextual sensitivity, and referential content, features that were, until quite recently, treated as markers of what made human communication unique. This has real consequences beyond scientific curiosity. Both African savanna elephants and African forest elephants are currently listed by the IUCN as threatened with extinction, savanna elephants as endangered, forest elephants as critically endangered, after a century of catastrophic decline driven by poaching, habitat loss, and conflict with expanding human populations. Recognizing that these animals maintain decades-long individual relationships, mourn identifiable individuals among their dead, pass ecological knowledge down through matriarchs, and call specific family members by something functioning like a name changes the moral weight of what's being lost every time a population disappears. It isn't only a population number shrinking on a chart. It's the erosion of individual relationships, memories, and, it now appears, the loss of voices that were addressed to specific, known, named individuals. Katie Payne felt something she couldn't hear in a Portland zoo in 1984, and it took the scientific community 40 years, thousands of hours of field recordings, 3 generations of researchers, and a machine learning model capable of finding patterns no human ear could ever isolate, to confirm what she suspected. Elephants have been having entire conversations, directed at specific individuals, in frequencies and structures that were simply invisible to us. They've been calling their calves, their mothers, their sisters, their companions, by name, for as long as elephants have existed. We only just built the tools required to notice. The corpus of recordings researchers are working from still contains far more information than anyone has fully extracted. The machine learning tools keep improving. Nobody yet knows how a calf learns its own name, whether elephants use anything resembling names for anything besides individuals, or how deep this naming system actually goes. What's certain is that the line researchers used to draw between human minds and animal minds looks less like a wall today than it did a decade ago, and more like a gradient, one that we're only slowly learning how to measure. The elephants were never on the wrong side of some fixed boundary. They were simply speaking in a register we hadn't yet learned how to hear.